Hi, I'm Shakina Tawahene, Deputy Editor and Commercial Editor at Mortgage Solutions. Welcome to today's Masterclass of HSBC covering the trends and attitudes towards sustainability in the home. This session will take a look at how views have changed over time and some of the factors influencing the take-up of retrofitting. It will be presented by Tim Lord, Head of Climate and Energy at HSBC UK, and he'll be joined by Tracie Burton, Senior Corporate Account Manager at HSBC UK at the end of the questions. You'll be able to submit these questions during the presentation and at the end of the session while we're doing the Q&A bit. So please feel free to do so using the boxes on your screen. And with that, I'll hand over to Tim. Thank you.
Great, thanks Shakina, and hi everyone. It's great to be here. So yeah, as Shakina says, I'm Tim Lord. I'm Head of Energy and Climate for HSBC UK. What does that mean? It means I lead our work on climate and energy right across the UK business, including with our retail customers and thinking about how we can support them in building retrofit. My background is that I've been with HSBC for a couple of years now, but before that I spent about 20 years working for the UK government on lots of climate and energy issues. So I'm old enough to have worked for the last Labour government and also under the coalition government, and then the Conservative-led administrations from 2015 onwards. And I spent a lot of that time kind of wrestling with the challenges around building retrofit. So great to be here because I think it's a really important topic, and also mortgage brokers and mortgage providers I think are absolutely fundamental to how we deliver building retrofit in the UK. So I was going to try and cover two main things really today. First of all, a bit of a perspective from a kind of policymaker on why retrofit matters, what it really means, and a bit of the kind of top-down perspective, if you like, because I think that's really important to understand how the market might shift. And then secondly, to dive in, as Shakina said at the beginning, into some of the public views around climate and energy and what they mean for the retrofit agenda, the barriers that we need to tackle to enable consumers to undertake building retrofit, and the role that mortgage providers and mortgage brokers can play in that. I'm very open to questions. I always get good questions on these kind of topics, so very open to anything that you wanted to ask. And Tracie will be joining me at the end for the Q&A. So if that makes sense from the point of view of what we're going to cover today, I'll dive into a few slides. And as I said, what I wanted to start with was how policymakers think about this. And the way that policymakers think about it is they tend to start with the big picture. So what is the big picture on building retrofit? Well, the first thing is, ultimately, the motivator for why we need to retrofit our buildings is around reducing emissions. So as you'll know, the UK has a net zero target for 2050. It's also got some pretty ambitious targets in terms of how we get to 2050. So in 2030, 2035, and soon 2040, the government has set emissions targets. And what you can see on this chart is emissions from buildings here in the UK. The dotted line is from 2010 until today, and then the solid line on the right is the projection of what we'll need to achieve in order to get the UK to net zero. So buildings at the moment, give or take about 20% of UK emissions overall. And what you can see on that dotted line is that emissions have come down a bit over the last 15 years or so, from about 70 million tonnes per year to about 60 million tonnes per year. But it's worth saying a couple of things. That over that time, buildings have been a relatively small contributor to overall UK emission savings. About 10% of the emission savings we've delivered over that time have been from buildings. Most of them have been from the power sector. So as we've closed down dirty CO2 emitting coal-fired power stations, we've replaced them with things like offshore wind and solar and so on. That's where the majority of emission savings in the UK have come from. But that is not what is going to be the case in the future. Obviously, you can only reduce emissions from the power sector so much. The next phase of net zero transition has to be about a much wider set of sectors across the economy. And in particular, it has to be about our buildings. So how do we actually get there? Well, the second thing that policymakers think about is kind of where are those emissions coming from, and therefore kind of what can we do about them? And what these two charts show is where are emissions coming from within our building stock. So on the left-hand side, you've got the sources of emissions from our residential buildings. And as you can see in the blue and the red and the pink, the vast majority of emissions that come from residential buildings come from heating. That's a combination of heating, so obviously particularly in the winter, or indeed the last couple of days in London at night, if it's been anything like as cold in your homes as it's been in mine. And some of it from hot water, but heating is absolutely the key challenge and the vast majority of emissions that we produce from our homes. So how do we tackle that? Well, the emission savings from different interventions are captured on the side in terms of thousands of kilograms per year that different savings can make in an individual home. And what you can see is you can make some savings as a result of energy efficiency. So at the top, you've got things like draft proofing, roof and loft insulation, relatively straightforward interventions, but things that save some CO2, but not a huge amount. You've then got some much more intrusive and challenging energy efficiency interventions, things like internal wall insulation, external wall insulation. Now, they do save more, but they're also quite intrusive and generally quite expensive. But at the bottom, what you can see is where the big saving comes from, and that's from things like air source heat pumps or other forms of decarbonised zero CO2 heating sources. And the reason that obviously saves emissions is because if you're not burning gas in a boiler or burning oil in an oil burner, you're getting your energy instead, in the case of a heat pump, from the electricity grid, and the emissions there are much lower and coming down all the time. So that is really, from a policymaker's point of view, the big challenge is, first of all, to some degree, how can we get people to make their homes energy efficient? But fundamentally, it's about how do we get them to decarbonise their heating source. Of course, they might do some other things alongside that, things like rooftop solar, which can make sense in a lot of homes, things like batteries, which again can make financial sense for consumers. But the really big challenge is that one around heating. So the next chart that policymakers think about might be something like this. So this is the kind of flip side of the emissions chart I showed at the beginning. How do you get that emissions chart down? You do it by getting this chart up. So this is the deployment pathway for heat pumps and other forms of low carbon heating, which was set out in the recent Climate Change Committee report, which was advising the government on how to hit its decarbonisation targets. And what you can see is at the moment, the UK is installing about 100,000 heat pumps a year. That needs to rise really, really significantly. So to about 500,000 a year in 2030, to over 1 million by about 2033, to over 1.5 million per year by 2035. And you maintain that at a pretty consistent level on an ongoing basis. So that is a huge challenge, moving from 100,000 a year to those kinds of numbers. One thing that is worth pointing out is that 100,000 a year is roughly what the kind of level that the EV deployment was at 5 or so years ago, but now many multiples of that in the UK. So you can, and you have seen some of those changes happening already in other decarbonisation technologies, but obviously home heating, because it's a bit more intrusive and so on, it is an even bigger challenge. And I'll come back to some of those issues later. So if we're installing all those heat pumps, the next thing that policymakers will think about is how much is it going to cost and who's going to pay for it. So this chart shows the estimated capex requirements, so the additional capital expenditure we need to spend in the UK to make this change happen. And what you can see is obviously in 2025, that's a couple of £1 billion, but it rises to 10 billion plus and indeed 15 billion plus for most of the period out to 2050. So that is a real transformation in terms of the amount of money that we're spending in the UK on retrofitting homes, and it's also very, very consistent. So to look at it one way, that is a massive challenge to mobilise that amount of money. To look at it another way, it's obviously a big opportunity for lenders and for brokers. Assuming consumers want this stuff, they're going to want to borrow money to do it. The majority of this will need to be privately rather than publicly financed. So a massive opportunity for the lenders who can get it right as consumer demand comes through. It's worth saying as well, 15 billion pounds is a lot of money. Having said that, we spend about 150 billion, I think, a year going out for dinner in restaurants. We spend about 10 billion a year on our pets. So it's not an inconceivably large amount of money, but it is a significant level of expenditure. The other thing to say is that there are also savings. If you're going to think below the line of this chart, there are some savings that come with heat pumps, in particular where they're well installed. And we need to think about how we can maximise those savings for consumers. And again, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later on. So to conclude a bit about kind of policymaker thinking around this is a pretty big challenge. It's pretty hard to do. There's a lot of big graphs that show you the emission savings, the costs, the numbers of heat pumps, etc. But you can start feeling a little bit daunted by the challenge at that point. So it's worth saying, these kinds of technology transitions have happened in the past, and thinking a bit about how they happen. And this is one example that I quite like using, which is the New York Easter Day Parade in 1900 and in 1913. So on the left, you have the Easter Day Parade 1900. Spot the car is the question in that one. I have helped out there by putting a little red circle around it. So you can see one car in the Easter Day Parade. Everything else is horse-drawn. Now on the right, 1913, spot the horse. There's no red circle because there's no horses in the parade. That technology transition in New York has happened very, very quickly. And what we see when we think about these kinds of transitions is that often they take quite a long time to get going, but once the economics line up, once the consumer incentives line up, they can happen very quickly. And we see that in lots and lots of different areas. So these charts show adoption rates of different technologies by households. This is for the US on the left, and then infrastructure systems on the right. And infrastructure systems are really important because if we are transitioning from gas to heat pumps and other forms of low carbon heating, we need to have the infrastructure that supports that. At the moment, we have that infrastructure in the gas grid that the vast majority of us, about 80% plus of UK households, are connected to. We're going to need to build the electricity infrastructure, which will support, of course, low carbon heating. And what we see here is that adoption rates, as I say, happen pretty slowly at the beginning, but once they hit about 10%, they go very quickly. So on the left, you can see refrigerators in grey, radios in that kind of gold color TV coming through, mobile phones as we move to the right, and more recently the internet. All of those going from sort of 10% adoption to 80-90% plus in 20 years or so. And so that's the kind of challenge that we need to meet clearly in terms of retrofit and heating. But what this shows is that it's a big challenge, but it's not necessarily an insurmountable one. But the problem with policymakers sometimes, and I say this as a kind of recovering policymaker myself, is that often we tend to think a little bit too much about these big charts, and we don't think necessarily enough about people. Because ultimately, the UK building retrofit challenge, the UK heating transition, isn't about government making one or two big decisions. It's about 28 million households roughly in the UK making 28 million individual decisions to replace their boiler with a heat pump or another form of low carbon heating, to incur the hassle, the cost, the understanding challenges to do that. And everyone has their own set of priorities. The couple we've used here have a baby on the way, maybe they just bought a new home. For them, perhaps they might be interested in low carbon heating, but it's fair to suspect that it might not be absolutely top of their list of priorities. So one of the things that I've got interested in over the last few years is kind of what do people actually think about this stuff? How can they be engaged around it? How might they be engaged around it in future? So in thinking about that, one of the things that we often start with is thinking about public concern around climate change, because although the heating transition isn't just about climate, it's about warmer homes, it's about lower energy bills. One of the key drivers is climate. Clearly, if climate change wasn't an issue, if CO2 emissions weren't causing climate change, we probably wouldn't worry too much about the use of boilers, or certainly as much as we do at the moment. And what you can see on climate change is actually, and this perhaps runs contrary sometimes to some of the media narrative around it, is that public concern is pretty high. So what you can see here is the number of people who say they're very concerned about climate change. That's the red at the bottom, that they're quite concerned about it, or fairly concerned about it, which is the lighter red, and then the ones who are not very or not at all concerned. And what you can see between 2012 and 2024 is, first of all, that number is pretty high. So about 80% of people say they're either fairly or very concerned about climate change. And the public polling work I've been involved in, it is very rare that you get 80% of the UK public to agree on anything. This is roughly the same number of people as people who say they like fish and chips in the UK. The only things that get higher than this are things like, do you like the NHS, or do you support the NHS existing, or do you support the monarchy, or those kinds of things, which are generally have very high levels of public support. So that's pretty unusual and interesting. The second thing is that the number of people who say they're very concerned has risen pretty significantly. So it's now well over 30%, approaching 40% of the population tick the kind of, very concerned box, which is, again, fairly unusual. If you're anything like me, you'll tend to tick one of the boxes towards the middle of those kinds of surveys. But you do have a pretty high level of public concern around climate change. But obviously, being concerned about climate change is not the same as saying, I want to spend money on decarbonising the heating in my home. So when we look at some of the evidence around that in a little bit more detail, we can unpack a little bit where the public is on this stuff. So the first thing to say is, on the left-hand chart here, you have the public views around low carbon heating. So as a society, we need to move to low carbon heating. You've got a pretty significant proportion of people at the bottom there who strongly agree with that. You've got about 40% of people who somewhat agree. You've then got a pretty big chunk of neutral, and then a smaller number, 11%, who either somewhat or strongly disagree. And actually, you see pretty similar numbers where you ask people, I ought to do my part by having low carbon heating in my house. Again, a pretty significant proportion or a very large majority of people either supportive of that or neutral towards that statement. Now, clearly, ultimately, as we get to 2050, we're going to need every household or pretty much every household in the UK to have moved to low carbon heating. But that sort of 13 plus 33% at the bottom is a pretty significant potential initial market size of people who are relatively well disposed to all of this. The other thing to say on the right there is around views on heat pumps themselves, where again there's some media narrative around heat pumps, not all of it positive, but actually in terms of the survey data that we have, people tend to be, insofar as one can be supportive or unsupportive of a white box that sits on the side of your house, people tend to be reasonably supportive. So again, about 15% of people strongly supporting, around 40% tend to support, a pretty large number of neutral, and then some people who would tend or strongly oppose. So you've got a reasonably significant potential initial market size. Again, it's obviously worth saying that is not the same as saying I want to get a heat pump now, or I'm willing to spend money on doing it at exactly this point, but it does mean that there is a potential initial market there, potentially people who are initially disposed to do it. The next thing to think about is around public awareness of how people use heat in the home and of low carbon heating systems. So what we see here is that there's a pretty high level of attention paid to heat used in the home. Anyone who has had kind of thermostat wars with their husband or their wife or their children will know all about that. And obviously, what's happened to energy prices in the last few years, in particular following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, means people have been even more focused on energy used in the home because it's been a lot more expensive. So what we see there is nearly 80% of households either think about it a lot or think about it a fair amount. And what we've also seen in the last few years is higher levels of kind of literacy associated with energy use in the home. So as people get things like EVs and solar panels, they start to understand what a kilowatt hour of energy actually means in practice. They start to understand that in general, electric devices, EVs compared to petrol cars or heat pumps compared to boilers or whatever it might be, are generally more efficient in the way that they use energy. So again, you've got a reasonably strong group who are pretty focused on the way that heat is used in the home. But on the other hand, if you look at the bottom chart here, in terms of awareness of low carbon heating systems, that tends to be pretty significantly lower. You've got a bit under 10% of people who say they know a lot about low carbon heating systems, and you've got another 20% or so who say they know a fair amount. It's worth saying that often people answer these surveys, and slightly, particularly men actually, as the evidence shows, they tend to overstate their knowledge a little bit. So you can probably assume these are on the higher side of the reality. So awareness of low carbon heating systems, much, much lower than awareness and understanding of heat use in the home. And a pretty large number of people know either a little or hardly anything about all these things. The other thing that's worth saying is when you do look at survey data that people have around people's willingness to spend on these things, you tend to get answers which are perhaps a little less encouraging in terms of heat pump adoption. So people, while they might in principle be willing to look at this, they don't want to spend a lot of money doing it. They certainly don't want to have higher energy bills as a result. And if we think back to that couple who were putting together the cot on the previous slide, obviously people have a lot of competing calls on their resources, and if you say to someone, do you want a heat pump or do you want an electric car or whatever it might be, they may well say yes. If you say, do you want a heat pump or an electric car instead of a holiday, you probably get a different set of answers. So that point about these being kind of desirable technologies for a significant group of people in principle is not the same as saying necessarily that people want to spend a lot of money on them, or that they want to have to make choices not to do other things in order to get a heat pump or solar panels or a battery or whatever it might be. So just to kind of conclude the presentation bit, and then we can get into some Q&A. What does that kind of mean in terms of how consumers think about this, and how mortgage providers and mortgage brokers can kind of play a role in all of this? So what it means is, you've got a pretty clear set of barriers to why people who might be predisposed to doing this kind of thing, because they want to warm a home, because they care about CO2 emissions, because they like being early adopters around technology, or whatever it might be. And what those are, first of all, starting on the left, is around knowledge. So it goes back to that evidence around people's understanding around low carbon heating systems and so on. Knowing that perhaps I should decarbonize the heating in my home at some point is not the same as knowing what would work in my house with my hot water tank in the roof and my boiler in the bathroom on the first floor, and my radiators, which I don't know whether they're the right size or not, and my pipe work in particular places. So understanding, first of all, what you might need to do in terms of technologies and how to get started is absolutely critically important. The second piece is around preparedness. So knowing when to do it, and having the opportunity to think about this at points in your life or your building or your home ownership journey, where it makes sense to do these kinds of things. So the majority of people replace their boiler when it breaks or when it's about to break. And if you're thinking of replacing a boiler and it's just broken, and you have a choice between a new boiler, which will give you a hot shower the following morning, or a heat pump, which might be installed in 3 months and possibly cost you a bit more, that's a pretty clear choice, I would say, for most consumers. So there's a real issue around how do we enable people to be prepared for this? How do we make sure they can understand what will work within their home that they either live in or perhaps that they're purchasing, so that they can make that decision at the right time? The other piece, of course, is that the times when people will think about these kind of things, they're generally around particular trigger points, particular life events. Purchasing a home or remortgaging a home might be a time where one is thinking about borrowing around things that they might invest in order to increase home value, in terms of being willing to take on some additional debt if it makes wider sense for them to do that. And again, obviously, mortgage providers, mortgage brokers have access to a lot of those trigger points and where people want to do those things. And then we can play a really important role in enabling them to. The third barrier is around installation costs. So, people, I've done focus groups around this, some of you might have as well. The cost of retrofit products is too high, is a real challenge. If you can get a boiler for less, an alternative technology which is cheaper, that's clearly going to be a problem. So how do we, first of all, get those installation costs down? And that's partly around public policy on things like subsidies for upgrading your boiler to an alternative heating source. Partly it's around how the supply chain operates, but it's also really importantly around the cost of finance and how we can get that cost of finance lower for consumers. The fourth piece is about running costs. So even if it's cheap or cheaper to install a heat pump than it was a few years ago, for example, people care a lot, and understandably and reasonably so, about what it will do to their energy bills. If they make that big investment up front, will they see a payback? When will they see that payback? So again, part of that is to do with the people doing my old jobs around government policy, for example, on the cost of gas versus the cost of electricity and so on. But again, the cost of finance can help with that. If the repayments can be lower, for example, than the savings, then that can make a huge difference in terms of incentivizing people to act. And then the last two really are about, again, things that I think that the banks and the mortgage providers and brokers can really help people with, which is around how do we enable them to access the supply chain, and how can we reduce the amount of hassle associated with these things? Because people, it's really important, I think, that we meet people where they are. They need reliable tradespeople to do the work. They need them to do it at a time that works for them. For example, if you're undertaking other building work in your home, or replacing your kitchen or bathroom or whatever it might be, that is a really good time to access all of these things. So enabling people to connect with that supply chain, hugely important, because that leads into the last point, which is about hassle. And again, that is a big barrier here. You know, thinking about replacing your kitchen or whatever, there is a hassle factor associated with that, but you have the desirable thing you wanted at the end of that process. Heating feels a bit less exciting in some ways than some of the other investments that one might make in one's home. So how do we get that hassle down for people? Now, what we can't do is obviously go out and install them ourselves, but and certainly in my case that would not be a good thing for anyone to do. But what we can do is reduce the hassle in the overall consumer journey, so we can hopefully make it easier for people to get the knowledge and the preparedness up front, to get the cost down in terms of installation and running, and the cost of finance, and then to be able to access that in a much simpler consumer journey. And we're starting to see some of the products in the market that enable that. HSBC has an energy efficient mortgage. Other providers have some of those products, but I still think we're actually in the relatively early phase of being able to do that. So I could talk about this stuff all day, as you can probably guess, in terms of the public attitudes and public polling and so on, and what it means for the consumer experience, and how banks can support that, and mortgage brokers can hopefully help facilitate some of those journeys. But I'll resist the temptation to do that. I will pause there, and I think the others will come back on screen, and we can perhaps dive into this with a few questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for that presentation. I'm hoping that everyone found that very informative, and thank you, Tracie, for joining us for this Q&A section. Just a reminder that we are still taking questions, so feel free to submit them on the box on your screen. And so I will go to the first one. I'll go to Tracie first, just to give Tim a little bit of a breather. So what resources or tools can mortgage brokers use to educate customers about retrofitting, sustainability and green mortgages?
Okay, I'm going to try and break that down. It's quite a long question, isn't it? So going back to sort of this resources and tools, there is actually a lot out there online itself. But I think before we start helping customers, we need to kind of know ourselves what's available. So it's kind of upskilling ourselves, so we've got all of that information in our own kit box before we have the conversations with customers. So the GFI, for example, springs to mind. The Green Finance Institute, they've just brought out a certificate in green mortgages, which is a short course that it gives you all the knowledge and keeps you updated with what's on the market at the moment. So that's probably a good place to start for your own sort of internal knowledge, if you like. And then from there, it's looking at using the online resources that are available with your customers, energy efficient calculators which are available to help customers understand what the needs are from the properties that they live in and the homes that they're buying. EPC reports, love them or loathe them, they do have they're a great starting point. So they do give some direction of where what you've got now, and these are some of the options that you can do. So there's quite a lot of information out there, but I think starting at home is probably the best place, and maybe getting your own knowledge up and using the resources and the tools that are out there. And your own local knowledge as well. So I'm thinking of things like flooding and coastal erosion and places like that around the UK. So if you live in an area like that, obviously your customers are going to be buying properties that may be subject to some of those issues as well. So knowing the area like the back of your hand and some of the issues that they may and what can they do about it as well. So there's quite a lot out there already. You're just going to have to go digging for it, but I think start from home first, and your own knowledge is key.
Of course, thank you. And Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's a great answer.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, what are some best practices for mortgage brokers to follow when advising customers on retrofitting, sustainability and green mortgages? So Tim, I'll come to you with that. Yeah,
sure. And then Tracie may want to add. I mean, I think obviously I wouldn't want to, people on the call will understand how to do the mortgage broker's job much better than I would. I think a lot of this is about meeting customers where they are or where they might be. So it's about signposting the kinds of products and services that might be available. It's obviously not for HSBC or for mortgage brokers to be giving people kind of direct advice around what to do in their homes. But we do also know that these kind of trigger points are really critical moments where people might be in a position to think about acting or to act. So I think really it's about how we signpost people to the things that are available, the products and services in terms of things like energy efficient mortgages and there's other products out there that are available, so that they can think about what might work for them at a particular moment. Clearly, what we also need is stronger incentives for consumers to act, whether those are economic incentives or other incentives. It has to ultimately make, for the vast majority of consumers, it has to make economic sense for them to do this kind of thing. So we need to make sure that there are the underpinning kind of demand drivers that sit alongside that. But I think for brokers, it's really about how do we point people in the right direction when they're at that point, introduce the potential consideration so that they can take decisions in a really informed way.
Yeah. To add to that, I think as well is to like you do your own fact find and the whole journey from when the customer walks through the door to to them getting the keys for the property. It's having a process in your kit bag. So thinking about common misconceptions. So what are they going to come in asking? I think a lot of customers, when I speak to brokers and some of my accounts, they think retrofitting is really expensive or it's just for wealthy, the wealthy, and they don't really, that tells me that the understanding's not there. So it's explaining what the benefits are. So it's not saving the planet by getting a heat pump. It's actually the benefits to you. If we funnel it right down, the benefits to you is in the longer term, it will save you on your energy and your energy bills. It will add value to your property as well. And you never know, you might get a check back from the grid each month. If your solar, for example, is producing excess energy potentially. So I think thinking about the common misconceptions and addressing those, communicating the benefits to the customer, and thinking about the key pain points. So customers always comes down to, myself included, how much is this going to cost me? So being knowledgeable about what grants are available, who are the people in your area that can do the work for you, and then you sort of linking all that together so you've got a really robust sort of script, if you like, for when your customers come in and you can help them and answer the questions.
Of course, thank you. And thinking a little bit more about sort of current affairs and how that might, change attitudes and trends. I mean, the current events, Donald Trump has expressed skepticism about climate change. And how do you think that might impact the UK? Because sometimes, some of the things he says do have an influence. So, Tracie, I'll come back to you on that one.
Oh, thanks for that one. Well, yeah, I mean, it's widely known, isn't it? He's not a fan of climate change, and he's all for support, cancelling all the work that's been done in America, and just sort of, supporting fossil fuels and all sorts of things. I mean, he has been known to make U-turns and change his mind quite often, as we've seen quite recently. But he's a businessman at the end of the day, and I think that this does create opportunities for business. So you never know; it may get round to he'll rethink and understand the importance of energy efficiency in the housing industry as one sector for one sector out of many, actually. So Tim, you've probably got a bit more to add to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wouldn't want to get into the politics of it too much, but I think the key thing is kind of what, particularly for the buildings transition, like what makes sense in the UK. You've got a pretty clear commitment from the current government around decarbonisation and around that being at the heart of the UK's economic growth strategy as the government articulates it. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, ultimately these things need to make sense for people, and what leaders of other countries say is not necessarily hugely important in the consideration that I might make when I'm thinking about, my boiler's going to probably, come to the end of its life in 3 or 4 years. Is now a good time for me to, future-proof my house, and how much is that going to cost, etc. It's not necessarily a huge influence on that. And the UK, is quite unique actually in terms of the way that we heat our homes. There's not many other countries that have a gas grid of the size and penetration that we do, or a level of energy efficiency that we have in our building stock. So I think while some of that kind of background noise, if you like, of course, it's not irrelevant, and it's very important in other aspects of the transition. I think for buildings, actually, it's really about how do we get those consumer journeys simplified, reduce hassle, enable people to access the supply chain, and make sure that it's affordable for them to be able to do it.
Of course, thank you. And Tim, you might have a bit more insight on this in regards to your role. So HSBC, obviously, as you know, is a global bank. So what are you doing to ensure you meet your 2030 and 2050 sustainable targets? And that's from all angles, and also in the UK particularly.
Yeah, sure. So as you say, we're a global bank. We operate right across about 60 countries, give or take, and we operate across pretty much every sector of the global economy. And as you'd expect, that comes with a significant emissions footprint from the things that we've lent money on in the past, and the fact that the global economy is still very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So as you say, we've set a set of targets around reducing emissions, including a net zero target for 2050. And really what we're doing is two things at a very high level. One is about how do we engage with our customers on the things that they need to do or might want to do in order to decarbonize. So that's everything from, large multinationals in terms of what their transition plans might look like, right through to the kinds of people that we're talking about today who might own or live in buildings that need decarbonising or that decarbonising might be an attractive option for them. So how do we make sure we're understanding that and what those transition plans look like? I mean, the second thing is really about how do we overall increase investment in some of the low carbon technologies that we need globally. So again, that's everything from offshore wind, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen production, EV networks, and so on and so forth. So making sure that we're thinking really hard about how do we access those markets, how do we make sure we've got the right set of products and propositions that enables us and our customers to invest in all of those. So we see this as a really, obviously a hugely important transition for environmental reasons, but also a hugely important transition for our customers, and ultimately for us, because one of the things with being a global bank, and HSBC has been around for 160 years now, is we need to be deeply embedded in the supply chains of the global economy, and clearly these are supply chains that are going to grow really significantly. So we see it as a big opportunity, of course, for our customers, but also ultimately, for how we think about the future.
Yeah, of course. And Trace, I'll come to you with this one. So Tim did mention a little bit about this in the presentation, but what do you see as the biggest challenges for customers, and how do we overcome them when it comes to sustainability?
Okay, I was just thinking about your previous question, actually. I was just going to add to that as well. No, it's only because it was bringing to mind. It's something I'm just quite proud of working for HSBC, is that so we're really focused on our own internal operations of the buildings that we have. So we're very, very sort of green, if you like, from that aspect. So it's our business travel is highly considered, and how much travel we do. All of our cars, our corporate cars now, are electric cars or hybrid cars, and obviously the suppliers that we use, from going from disposable coffee cups to paper, we don't really print that much now, but anything that we use from a supply, we want to know what their strategy is in order to help us achieve our 2050 goal as well. But going back to the question you actually asked me, Shakira, was the biggest challenges for our customers. So I think sort of jargon always seems to come up, jargon and understanding and the education. I think that's the challenge, and it's kind of a little bit like, you don't know until you know. And the things that we don't know, we tend to shy away from, don't we? So if a customer comes in asking, we don't know about it, we'll generally just sort of try and skirt around it. So I think as a broker, to gain and learn the experience of having those conversations and actually being an ambassador for it, you'll soon get a reputation for being the go-to broker who helps with the energy efficiency. But for customers, they obviously need to know where to go, who the suppliers are, what they need for their houses, how much is it going to cost, what's the journey, and maybe have some best practices, maybe have a scenario up your sleeve. So this is where Mr. Jones started, this is the journey he went to, that's where he finished, and that's the benefits that he's had from going through the retrofit journey, or just by doing one thing, for example, just having a case study, because being able to talk about a journey of somebody is quite powerful. So and being able to measure the impact of it all as well, so you can talk to your customers about real life cases.
Yeah, so creating a real picture in their minds. And Tim, I think you're going to come in with that.
Yeah, just to add to that really quickly, because it's worth saying as well that the challenge right now is not how do we get the kind of hardest parts of the market, people who don't have any lending on their properties, or people who've just got a brand new boiler, or people whose homes might be really expensive to retrofit, as a subset will be. It's not about how do we get those people to do this stuff. It is much more about how do we get people who perhaps do have capacity to borrow, where it's relatively more affordable, etc., to enable the market to scale. And in that context, obviously, we've talked about a number of the barriers already. But the other thing that I hear come up a lot of the time is people don't want to be the kind of first mover, right? So how do we get, if I think about electric cars, right? I've been working in this space for a long time. 10 years ago, you talk about electric cars and everyone say, "Oh, I'm not going to get an electric car. I've never even sat in an electric car." Whereas now, lots of people have them. Most people, I think, probably know someone who's got one, or have sat in an Uber or whatever that's electric, and so people will have much more awareness, and it feels less unfamiliar. So I think the other big challenge we've got is about how do we make it easy for those kind of people in that ramp up phase of some of those graphs that I talked about to make that decision, because I think the kind of multiplier effect that has is that it enables people Whether people get very excited going to someone's house and getting shown their heat pump is, dependent on taste a little bit, I guess. But you will start seeing these things in the wild, as it were, and as that happens, I think it becomes less daunting for people to consider that step themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, kind of around that, do you think people are really concerned about sustainability, considering the cost of living and the state of the economy and geopolitical issues at the moment? I mean, does that, you mentioned that bit in your presentation, maybe that gets put to the back burner. So do you think people are really putting that first? And Tim, I'll come back to you on that one.
Yeah, yes, I think people are concerned about sustainability, but I think that question is totally reasonable, and that people have quite a lot of other things to worry about, right? And you could say, particularly over the last year or two, whether it's pandemics or energy crises and cost of living crises and lots of other things. So I think, sustainability, decarbonisation for big parts of the population are a really important consideration, but it needs to make financial sense for people. It needs to be easier. It needs to be more accessible. It needs to be at the right time. And it's certainly not for us to tell people what they should be thinking about or tell people exactly what they should be spending their money on. Really, it's about how do we facilitate it, make it easier so that some of those barriers are a little bit easier for people to get through.
Mm-hmm. And Tracie, do you have any view on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really mixed bag about who you speak to. You get some people who are really really focused on it or on the journey, and you get other people who are, my heating is going up, my water's going up, cost of living, a pack of Lurpak is now £5, it used to be £2, and I don't have a lot of money left each month. So that's my priority at the minute, is just to get by, to be able to pay my bills before I even start thinking about other things. Mm-hmm. The magic is explaining to them, actually, in the long term after that's been done, you can actually save a little bit of money by making your home more efficient. So it's just having those really informed conversations within a fact find to find out, how we can help them save money in the longer term and add value to the property as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the government did recently come out with an announcement saying that it would open up 18,000 spaces to train people to do retrofitting in homes, but they obviously won't be available immediately. So how do you think we can meet these retrofit targets with the challenges that still remain around the number of trade people and the supply chain? And Tim, I'll come to you on that one.
Yeah, so it's I think great question, and it's definitely a really big challenge. If tomorrow 1 million people said, "Oh, actually, I do want to get a heat pump this year," like the supply chain would struggle to meet that right now. So it's really about how do we kind of scale up to enable those volumes to be higher. I think two things on that. One is that the supply chain is already a lot stronger than it was a year or two ago. So you have a number of the big energy utilities have already got stronger programs in place around building retrofit, and they offer through their apps and through other means, a much better way of people being able to access some of those. But you've also got smaller, newer, more innovative companies out there, and I've had some of them. One of my hobbies lately has been getting companies around to kind of do heat pump quotes. I find it very interesting finding out how they sell them and what that looks like. Not everyone's as nerdy as me, I know, but you've got some really interesting business models out there now, and companies which are really, really focused on it. So that supply chain is getting stronger. And the second piece is you do need government to do some of the things that I think it is doing, in all fairness, around providing support for people to retrain so that we're ready for the market to scale up. But I think actually the key thing is really about demand. So if you are a boiler fitter or an electrician or whatever it might be who wants to expand your skill set to be able to do this kind of stuff, that means taking time out of your business. It means losing revenue for a short period of time while you do that training. People do those kinds of things, but they do them when they can see the market growing, when they're getting asked for them. And I think that's the critical thing, is as demand comes, I think the supply chain will develop and scale along with it, in exactly the same as it should do in the banking and financial services sector. As people want these things more, we'll need to innovate more, we'll need to prioritize it more in terms of how we're providing the right products and propositions. But you kind of need those things to happen in lockstep. But I think actually, very often in markets which are functioning well, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, of course. And Tracie, do you have an opinion on that as well?
Yeah, so I was making myself smile thinking about it, actually. So targets are amazing, aren't they? Targets are targets. They move and change all the time. I hope my boss isn't on, actually, because I change my target all the time, depending on how successful I'm being. But, they're not set in stone. And I think the most important thing is if we're going in the right direction, then that's a really good thing. So it's pointless setting a target which is unachievable, because it's off-putting. But this whole thing is creating a lot of opportunity. I'm a massive fan of apprenticeships, and I've heard, there's going to be more apprenticeships in the skill set that's needed to be able to make these homes in the UK energy efficient. So there's so much opportunity there. And as Timmy said there, if you take a little bit of time out in order to upgrade some of your, upskill some of your staff and to be able to do some of this work, that's a really good thing. And we'll only be in a bit of trouble if everybody does it at the same time. At the minute, we're not in that space at the moment. So I think at the minute, we're able to keep up to speed with the demand. But targets are, it's a bit like, okay, but as long as we're making progress is the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that is the end of our time here. So thank you both for taking the time to present and answer the questions. There are some questions we didn't get around to answering, but they will be answered post-session directly if there are any that, HSBC is able to respond to. But thank you both for being with us today. And thank you to everyone watching as well. And I hope you found that informative and gained something from it. And hopefully we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.